and the discussion was so intense, whether they were anti-Frankenstein or anti-the creature. And we had such a hot debate going on. And then the bell rang and they said, no, I wish we could finish this. And I thought, oh, but we can't. So I didn't tell them. They had already left when I realized that I could do the follow-up. So I threw a follow-up up and just said, how do you feel after having heard today's conversation? Like, what final thoughts do you have about our discussion or about the book? Didn't tell them, and half the class had it completed by the next day without having known there was an assignment to be completed.
Hi there, I'm Annalisa from the team behind Parlay, and I recently caught up with Jessica to hear about how she ran a follow-up written roundtable so students could share their ideas and thoughts that they might not have expressed during the verbal roundtable. So if you're interested in trying a follow-up, check it out.
Actually love the Parlay roundtables. It kind of all depends on what I'm looking for from the kids. This time of year, the verbals are working very, very well. So they're more willing to take those risks. The last couple assignments, we go through the Parlay. I found that having a few days to prep those notes in advance is helpful. I've done them a lot, and they're not nearly as rich, not nearly as intense of a conversation. But the kids love having their notes ahead of time, and they feel more prepared for those discussions.
Usually you'll set up the questions, or do they come prepared with questions?
I usually set up the questions, and then they have the option to add any questions. And when we actually get to the discussion, we don't have to work sequentially. I just open it up and say, where do you want to start? And usually they'll start with my questions, but then we digress. The last one, that's why I chose to do the follow-up. They really digressed. We had been talking about Frankenstein, and then we got to discussing people's reactions and people's behaviors, and they started tying it in with school shootings and violence. And so like they really extended the conversation beyond what I had prepped, but at least we used the Parlay questions as a springboard for that.
And so how do you kind of let these conversations unfold? A lot of times what will happen is the current speaker will speak, there's people in line, and then you have students that say, oh, I really want to jump onto what that person said. Do you kind of let that unfold as it goes, or do you try and stay on one topic and move to the next? What do you find kind of works best with your students?
I'll let it unfold unless a monopoly starts to begin. And then I'll say, you know what, we have the queue waiting. Why don't we get back to those ideas? So if you really have something, jot it down. And when it's your time to come back in, then you can come back in. But I hate to stop the discussion just because we're in a format.
Mm-hmm. And are you managing the queue, or do you typically have students who are doing that?
Typically the students manage it. A lot of times I sit back just with a notebook and try to jot down things that they've said, and maybe even things that they don't realize that they've said, so that we can kind of piggyback on that at the end.
And do you ever look at the data at the end, or are there certain elements of like that summary data that you reflect on with the class?
We do. The kids love the word clouds. So that's the first thing they go to check. And I do too, especially in the written. I'll check that first to see if I can see the overwhelming and overarching theme of what they've written about. My final exam, I teach AP in college writing, and my final exam is always a self-reflection. So there's a lot of metacognition that goes into that. And actually, I decided to use the Parlay Genie today to get that started. So I was super excited. I was thrilled with the questions that it generated. And then I love that I could add to that. But I always like to take a look at those in planning for next year. And when I realized I could export that and have that data, that was my absolutely, we're going to use Parlay instead of just trying to continue a class discussion.
I mean, it was your first time doing it, so you were probably just testing it out. What were your goals to do that follow-up? How did you start?
I decided after the kids left, I realized that feature was available to me, and the discussion was so intense, whether they were anti-Frankenstein or anti-the creature, and we had such a hot debate going on, and then the bell rang, and they said, no, I wish we could finish this. And I thought, oh, but we can't. So I didn't tell them. They had already left when I realized that I could do the follow-up. So I threw a follow-up up and just said, how do you feel after having heard today's conversation? Like, what final thoughts do you have about our discussion or about the book? Didn't tell them, and half the class had it completed by the next day without having known there was an assignment to be completed.
Wow, that's really cool. And in terms of the quality of their responses, was it mostly that they wanted to expand on the ideas that they were already mentioning? Or were there a lot of like new ideas coming up in that as well?
Most of it was an expansion. Some of it was
Okay.
because we had two very different sides. A lot of it was, I see where they're coming from, and then they kind of re-justified their position.
Mhm.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. We don't always get a chance to go back and, recertify the counter arguments. So I thought that, and with, teaching the skill of argumentation and looking at rebuttals and counterclaims, I thought that was great. And I'm already thinking like how in my writing class I can prep that into that essay next year. A lot of times I would use it to kind of springboard an idea. So we would take a look at a concept, and then that would kind of create some of that background knowledge that maybe the kids didn't have. We do a lot of discussions about topics prior to them writing in whatever rhetorical mode we're studying. I can see where having the ability to do that, especially anonymously, they would be able to provide each other with some of that feedback before they actually get into the writing process.
I'm curious, any interesting feedback from students about Parlay specifically, or even from yourself, constructive feedback towards the tool? Are there parts of it that are confusing? Are there parts of it that, take some time to get used to?
I think it took us a little bit of time, especially on the verbals, to get accustomed to everything. I think the writtens make total sense to them, and the format works well. The construction works very well. I find they work extremely well, especially on days I'm not here, because if I'm off at a conference, I could be logged in and interacting with them, which is super, super helpful. The verbals, it took a little bit of time to understand, getting in the queue and waiting. Definitely having the automatic fill feature now, that as soon as one's done, the next one can step right in, takes away some of the logistics of it.
What were some of the things you needed to remind your class of in those first few verbal discussions?
A lot of them need reminders just to remember to, enter the queue, that you couldn't just sit there and wait for me to call on you. I love the fact that I can nudge them, and I can do that discreetly without anybody knowing about that. So I think that was probably the biggest turnaround for them. They're used to just open their mouth and go ahead and talk. My kiddos that don't like to talk no matter what the format is. So it doesn't matter if it's a parlay, it doesn't matter if it's a Socratic seminar, they're not interested. I can get them to talk a little more because I can, without having to look at them and, draw attention to them, remind them that they have to make that participation. I do like the fact that at least they have notes that they've prepared. So it's super helpful, especially if a student's absent, to do that, to be able to say, well, they've still engaged somewhat in the conversation. I do find that my kiddos that like to hurry up and get their answers done, they're my first to ring in, and they've got to get everything moving. So sometimes I deliberately dump them out of the queue so that they can't monopolize that early. I'm like, oh no, what happened? You'll have to just jump back in.
That's funny.
I definitely like the improvements that have been made. I love the AI feature that's coming. I know it's coming everywhere, but I really appreciated just being able to see. Sometimes as teachers, we get stuck in our way of doing things and our way of asking questions. And I like that it just, had the same concepts, but gave me a different voice as to how to phrase those. So definitely like those updated features. And I like the control that I have with the parlays. So I don't know that there's anything right now that I would say, I wish this were happening.